In the Rome of 1510, three men were simultaneously changing the history of art. Michelangelo was alone on the scaffolding of the Sistine Chapel, painting the ceiling of the most important church in Christendom by himself, refusing all assistance, working in conditions he later described as physically destroying him. Leonardo da Vinci was in Milan, filling notebooks with mirror-script observations about water and light and the nature of things, finishing almost nothing. And Raphael Sanzio, 27 years old, newly arrived from Florence, installed by papal command in the rooms immediately above the Sistine Chapel, was running the largest and most productive artistic enterprise in Rome, charming every cardinal and ambassador who crossed his path, and painting the walls of the Vatican with images of such serene, achieved beauty that his contemporaries called him divine. He died at 37. In the 2 decades between his arrival in Rome and his death on his birthday in 1520, he produced a body of work, frescoes, altarpieces, portraits, architectural drawings, archaeological surveys, that would serve as the primary model for academic painting in Europe for the next 300 years. He was not the most technically radical of the Renaissance masters, not the most philosophically ambitious, not the most personally tortured. He was simply, by the judgment of most of his contemporaries and many of his successors, the one who had most perfectly achieved what painting could be. Urbino, a court education. Raphael was born on April 6, 1483, in Urbino, a small hill city in the Marche region that was, despite its size, one of the most sophisticated cultural centers in 15th century Italy. Federico da Montefeltro, the duke who had built Urbino into what it was, had died 6 years before Raphael's birth, but the culture he created, humanist, elegant, obsessed with classical learning and the relationship between art and virtue, shaped the city Raphael grew up in. His father, Giovanni Santi, was the court painter and a poet of modest reputation, and he was Raphael's first teacher. Giovanni recognized his son's extraordinary facility early and began training him in the basics of composition, color, and drawing before the boy was 10. But Giovanni died in 1494, when Raphael was 11, and his mother had died 3 years earlier. The orphan boy was taken in by relatives and, in his mid-teens, placed in the workshop of Pietro Perugino in Perugia, the leading master of the Umbrian school and one of the most accomplished painters in Italy. Perugino's style was defined by softness, gentle contours, serene expressions, landscapes of tender lyricism, devotional scenes of contemplative quiet. Raphael absorbed it completely. His early works, painted in his late teens and early 20s, are so close to Perugino's manner that they were for centuries misattributed, and even now specialists sometimes dispute the authorship of works from this period. But even within the Perugino style, something was already different. A spatial clarity, a firmness of architectural structure, a quality of inhabited three-dimensionality that Perugino never achieved and that Raphael seems to have arrived at intuitively. The Betrothal of the Virgin, painted in 1504 at the age of 21, marks the end of the Umbrian period and announces what is coming. The composition is derived from a painting by Perugino on the same subject, and the debt is visible. But where Perugino's version is flat and ceremonial, Raphael's opens into space, the circular temple in the background recedes in mathematically precise perspective, the figures in the foreground are arranged with a freedom and naturalness that the master never managed, and the whole image has a kind of breathing room, a sense of air between the figures and between the figures and the architecture, that Perugino's work never quite found. Florence, learning from giants. In 1504, Raphael moved to Florence, arriving with a letter of introduction and the ambition appropriate to a young man who knew he was talented but had not yet tested himself against the best. What he found in Florence was a competition between Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci so intense, and so public, that the entire city had taken sides. Michelangelo had just completed the David. Leonardo had just returned from Milan. Both men had been commissioned to paint battle scenes for the council hall of the Palazzo della Signoria, and the city was watching. Raphael watched too. He had 4 years in Florence, and he used them not to compete with these men, which would have been futile, but to study them with the same systematic attention he had once given to Perugino. From Leonardo he took the pyramidal composition. The arrangement of figures in a stable triangular formation that gives multi-figure scenes their visual coherence, and the sfumato technique of softening edges with thin glazes. From Michelangelo he took the anatomical confidence, the understanding of how the body carries weight and moves through space, the sense that figures in a painting have actual physical mass rather than being colored shapes on a flat surface. What Raphael did with these borrowings was not synthesis in the mechanical sense of mixing ingredients. He understood what each man was doing and why, and he took from each only what served his own purposes, which were different from the purposes of either. Michelangelo was interested in the heroic body, the figure at the limit of its physical capacity. Leonardo was interested in the mystery of expression, the thing behind the face. Raphael was interested in harmony. In the possibility that a composition could be arranged so that every element supported every other element, so that nothing jarred and nothing was superfluous and the whole produced a sensation of inevitable rightness. The Florentine Madonnas, the Madonna of the Goldfinch, the Bel Giardiniere, the Madonna del Prato, are the proof of this. In each of them, the Virgin, the Christ Child, and the young John the Baptist are arranged in a pyramidal grouping in an open landscape, and in each of them the arrangement seems not designed but discovered, as if this were simply the way these three figures would naturally sit together if you placed them in a field on a spring afternoon. The goldfinch that the Christ Child touches, a bird associated with the thistle, and therefore with the crown of thorns, introduces the shadow of what is coming into a scene of absolute maternal tenderness. The shadow does not disturb the surface. It deepens it. Rome, the stands and the School of Athens. In 1508, Pope Julius II summoned Raphael to Rome and gave him the commission that would define his career, the decoration of a suite of rooms in the Vatican Palace, the stands di Raffaello, that served as the papal apartments and library. Raphael was 25. He was being asked to decorate the private rooms of the most powerful man in the Christian world, and he was being asked to do it while Michelangelo, a few rooms and one floor below, was painting the Sistine ceiling. The rooms were to celebrate the four realms of human intellectual and spiritual activity: theology, philosophy, poetry, and law. The room assigned to philosophy, the Stanza della Segnatura, where the Pope signed official documents, was to receive a fresco representing the greatest thinkers of antiquity. The result was the School of Athens, finished around 1511, and it is arguably the most ambitious compositional achievement of the High Renaissance. The setting is a vast hall of classical architecture, barrel-vaulted, coffered, constructed in the manner of Bramante's designs for the new St. Peter's, which was being built simultaneously outside the Vatican walls. Through this hall move 58 figures representing the greatest philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists of the ancient world, arranged in groups that suggest ongoing conversations, arguments, demonstrations, and solitary meditations. At the center, framed by the arch at the hall's far end, walk Plato and Aristotle, Plato pointing upward toward the realm of ideal forms, Aristotle extending his hand palm down toward the empirical world. The two gestures between them encompass the fundamental division in Western philosophy, rendered in a single visual image of extraordinary economy. The portraits concealed within the figures are one of the painting's most discussed features. Plato carries the face of Leonardo da Vinci, the elder statesman of Italian art, the sage pointing toward ideas and away from the material world. Heraclitus, the weeping philosopher, solitary and brooding, seated on the steps with his head in his hand, carries the face of Michelangelo, who was working below Raphael's feet as the fresco was being painted, in a posture not unlike this one. And in the lower right corner, looking out at the viewer from among a group of geometers, Raphael placed his own self-portrait, modest, slightly apart from the main action, watching. The claim embedded in this image is extraordinary. That the intellectual tradition of ancient Greece is continuous with the Rome of Julius II, that the conversation between Plato and Aristotle is the same conversation that was happening in the Vatican in 1510, and that the artists of the High Renaissance, including the one painting this fresco, are participants in that tradition, not servants of it. It is a manifesto for the dignity of the artist, painted on the wall of a pope's private apartments, by a 28-year-old from Urbino. The Sistine Madonna, a woman who knows. Among the altarpieces Raphael produced during the Roman years, the Sistine Madonna, painted around 1512 for the Church of San Sisto in Piacenza, is the one that has generated the most persistent discussion and the most varied responses. It is now in the Gemäldegalerie Gallery in Dresden, where it has been since 1754, and it is one of the most visited paintings in Germany. The composition is deliberately theatrical. A curtain has been drawn aside to reveal a vision. Mary stands on clouds, the Christ child on her arm, and she is walking, not seated on a throne, not enthroned in glory, but moving, approaching the viewer. The two saints who flank her, Sixtus on the left, Barbara on the right, gesture toward her and downward, as if presenting her to us. And she looks at us directly. The quality of that gaze is what the painting is about. It is not the serene, slightly distant gaze of the Madonna in most Renaissance altarpieces. It is aware. It knows where she is going and what her child will become and what that will cost. There is no grief in it. Raphael was too committed to harmony for overt grief. But there is something that sits just beneath serenity, a depth behind the composed surface that distinguishes this image from the purely decorative Madonnas of the tradition and keeps it, for many viewers, disturbing in a way that is hard to articulate. The two cherubs at the bottom of the painting, pudgy, winged, their chins resting on their folded arms, looking upward with expressions of mild philosophical puzzlement, have become perhaps the most reproduced detail in the history of Western art. They appear on mugs, posters, phone cases, and wrapping paper. They were intended as a visual note of levity in a composition of considerable gravity. They have achieved a cultural life entirely independent of the painting they belong to. The Fornarina, the woman behind the Madonnas. In the portrait known as La Fornarina, the baker's daughter. Now in the Palazzo Barberini in Rome, Raphael painted a woman who is almost certainly Margherita Ludi, the woman Vasari identified as the great love of his life. She sits against a dark background, partially draped, her right arm bearing a bracelet inscribed with Raphael's name in Latin, Raphael Urbinus. She looks at the viewer with the directness and self-possession of someone who knows exactly why she is being painted and is entirely comfortable with the fact. The identification of Margherita Ludi as the model for the Fornarina and, more controversially, as the model for many of Raphael's Roman Madonnas, including the Sistine Madonna and the Donna Velata, is based primarily on Vasari's biography and on stylistic comparisons between the portraits and the altarpieces. The argument is that the face of the Virgin in Raphael's late Roman work is consistent enough across different paintings to suggest a single living model, and that this model was the same woman who appears in the two secular portraits. If this is correct, it means that the most celebrated religious images of the High Renaissance, images that define the visual appearance of the Madonna for centuries of subsequent art, were painted from a baker's daughter from Trastevere, a woman of no social standing who was Raphael's companion in defiance of pressure from the papal court to marry a cardinal's niece. The Cardinal Bibbiena had arranged a betrothal between Raphael and his niece Maria. Raphael accepted the arrangement and postponed the marriage indefinitely for years, never breaking the engagement formally but never proceeding with it. He died unmarried. Margherita Ludi reportedly entered a convent after his death. Whether the identification is correct or not, the Fornarina itself is one of the most psychologically direct portraits of the Renaissance, a woman painted not as an emblem of virtue or social status but as herself, with a quality of personal presence that is unusual in the period and that suggests a relationship between painter and subject more intimate than the usual commission. The Transfiguration, an unfinished prophecy. The last painting Raphael worked on, left unfinished at his death and completed by his pupil Giulio Romano, was the Transfiguration, commissioned by Cardinal Giulio de' Medici for the Cathedral of Narbonne. It was displayed at the head of Raphael's bier when his body lay in state in his studio on April 7, 1520, the day after his death. The painting is in two registers. In the upper half, Christ is transfigured, his body blazing with light on Mount Tabor, flanked by Moses and Elijah, while three apostles below him are overwhelmed by the vision. In the lower half, disconnected from this celestial event, a group of people surround a boy possessed by a demon, trying to heal him. The apostles left at the foot of the mountain gesture upward, as if pointing toward the divine source that might accomplish what they cannot. This vertical division. Heaven above, a world of suffering and human inadequacy below, connected by gesture and gaze but not by direct contact, is unlike anything in Raphael's earlier work. The lower section in particular, with its swirling figures, dramatic contrasts of light and shadow, and heightened emotional temperature, anticipates the Baroque in ways that seem to belong to a different artistic generation. Whether this represents a genuine shift in Raphael's development, or the intervention of Giulio Romano's completion, is a question that has never been fully resolved. What is certain is that the painting was considered, by those who saw it immediately after Raphael's death, as the summation of his achievement, and as a prophecy of what he might have done if he had lived. He was 37. Titian had another 56 years to paint. Michelangelo would live to 88. The question of what Raphael's art might have become, whether it would have continued its trajectory toward harmony and perfection or broken toward the turbulence visible in the Transfiguration's lower register, is one of the permanent unanswerable questions of art history. The Pantheon and the epitaph. Raphael was buried in the Pantheon. The ancient Roman temple converted to a Christian church, the most perfectly preserved building of classical antiquity and the most prestigious burial site in Rome. The honor was extraordinary. He was interred beside the woman he was to have married, Maria Bibbiena, who had died before him, in a tomb he had commissioned himself and that incorporated an ancient statue of the Madonna he had purchased for the purpose. The epitaph on his tomb was written by the humanist scholar Cardinal Pietro Bembo, and it reads, "Here lies Raphael, by whom nature feared to be outdone while he lived, and when he died, feared that she herself would die." The hyperbole is Renaissance in kind, but the underlying claim is specific, that Raphael's paintings did not merely represent nature but competed with it, and that his death removed something from the world that nature itself could not replace. 3 centuries of European painting agreed. The academic tradition that dominated European art from the 17th century through the 19th treated Raphael's work as the standard by which painting was measured, the point of achieved perfection toward which students were directed and against which their progress was assessed. When the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood formed in England in 1848, their name was a deliberate rejection of this tradition. They wanted to go back to the painters who had worked before Raphael's influence had calcified into academic doctrine. But the name they chose was the highest tribute they could have paid him. To define the history of Western painting as everything before and after Raphael is to grant him the status of a watershed, the point at which the art of the Renaissance reached its fullest expression and from which everything subsequent was either continuation or reaction. He was 37. He worked for 22 years as a professional painter, from his mid-teens to his death. In those 22 years he produced the School of Athens, the Sistine Madonna, the Transfiguration, dozens of portraits and altarpieces, the architectural plans for St. Peter's, and the first systematic survey of the ancient monuments of Rome. The question is not what he achieved. The question is what the word harmony means, and whether a human being can embody it. The answer, according to the evidence, is apparently yes, for 37 years, in Urbino and Perugia and Florence and Rome.